They say some voices never really fade away. And if you spend a night in Barry White's old Los Angeles home, you'll understand what that means. The house itself looks ordinary from the outside, a sprawling Spanish-style estate with stucco walls and tall, arched windows. But neighbors whisper that, late at night, when the valley is quiet and the traffic has died down, they've heard something impossible to explain. A deep, melodic hum drifting through the air. A man's voice smooth, unmistakable, singing low as though carried on the walls themselves. The voice of Barry White. What unsettles them most is that this happens long after the house went dark. No music playing, no lights on, just silence. And then that rich, baritone echoing faintly, as if the walls remembered him. The history of the house. Barry White lived there during the height of his career in the 1970s. Stories say he recorded demo tapes in one of the rooms, a converted den with velvet curtains and low lighting where he could work alone at night. Friends described the space as almost sacred, filled with incense, red lamps, and that signature sense of romance he carried everywhere. After his passing, the room was left untouched for years, as though no one dared disturb it. Strange occurrences. Contractors hired to renovate the place after his death refused to finish their work. One described hearing a heavy chair drag across the wooden floor upstairs while he was alone in the house. Another swore he felt a hand rest firmly on his shoulder as he was wiring the old recording room. Neighbors have reported seeing faint lights flicker in the windows, always in the music room, as if someone lit candles in there. And more than once, passers-by claimed they could hear the slow, deliberate press of piano keys in the night. A journalist's night inside. One of the strangest accounts came from a local journalist who stayed in the house overnight while covering a story about Hollywood estates. She wrote that the atmosphere was thick and alive, heavy with a strange warmth that made the air vibrate. Around 2 a.m., as she tried to sleep in the guest room, she woke to the sensation of bass notes vibrating the mattress, like a stereo turned on somewhere in the house. But when she got up, everything was silent. The next morning, she found her recorder, which she'd left on the nightstand, had captured hours of low-pitched humming. No words, no instruments, just a deep, soothing hum that seemed to rise and fall like breath. Legacy or haunting. Some dismiss these stories as tricks of memory, the power of suggestion in a house once filled with music. Others believe Barry White never truly left, that his energy, his voice, and his presence were too strong to be silenced. Whether it's a haunting or simply the echo of a man who poured everything into his home, the estate has become a place of quiet reverence. And still, those who walk past late at night swear they hear it, that smooth baritone drifting through the dark, as if Barry White is still there, serenading the silence. The estate sits on a quiet street lined with palm trees that sway gently in the California breeze. During the day, the house feels almost ordinary. Sunlight spills across its terracotta roof, the wide front lawn trimmed neatly, the curved iron gates swinging open without protest. But at night, the place transforms. The white stucco takes on a dull gray sheen under the moonlight, the arched windows reflect shadows instead of light, and the long driveway seems to swallow the glow of passing headlights. Neighbors say that the silence is the first thing you notice. For a house so close to the city, there should always be noise: distant cars, laughter, music, the restless hum of Los Angeles life. Yet once you step onto the property line, it is as if the air muffles itself, pulling sound inward. People who've walked past after midnight describe it as oppressive, like being in a recording booth with the walls padded to swallow every vibration. Then, within that heavy silence, the faintest resonance begins. Low notes that rise like they're traveling through water, subtle at first but unmistakable once you focus. The humming. Some call it a trick of the imagination, the echo of memory stirred up by knowing who once lived here. But there are accounts too many to ignore of people who had no idea whose house it was. Delivery drivers, night workers, even a young couple who parked nearby and never returned. They all described the same thing. A deep, warm voice humming through the walls, reaching them as though the house itself were singing. Inside, the atmosphere is stronger. A former caretaker admitted that he couldn't stay after dark. He described the sensation of being followed as he walked down the long hallways, His own footsteps doubled by something heavier, slower, trailing just behind. In the grand living room, where the vaulted ceiling carried sound upward, he swore he could hear whispers circling above him like smoke, never distinct enough to understand, but always threaded with that unmistakable bass tone. And then there was the recording room. The den was converted during Barry's life into a space designed entirely for sound. Thick carpets, layered curtains, heavy doors that closed with an airtight seal. Contractors brought in after his death found old wiring hidden in the walls, cables leading to nowhere, as if some of the recording equipment had been dismantled but never properly removed. They claimed that when the room was left untouched for a few hours, it seemed to breathe on its own. The air grew warmer, heavier, and the faint smell of incense would return, even though nothing had been burned there in decades. One worker, a young electrician, left the project entirely after a single evening. He said he was crouched by the wall socket when a deep voice whispered directly into his ear so close, he felt the heat of breath. The words weren't clear, just a single syllable stretched low and long, vibrating through his body. When he spun around, the room was empty. Yet, on the dust-covered floor, he noticed the marks of shoes not his own pressed firmly into the carpet pile, as if someone had been standing there moments before. The most chilling accounts, though, come from those who dared to stay overnight. Guests reported waking to the sensation of a weight on their chest, like someone pressing down gently but firmly, almost in rhythm. One woman described it as being held by invisible arms. At first it felt protective, even comforting, until she realized she couldn't move. She lay frozen, her breath shallow, as a low voice hummed just above her face. When she finally broke free, gasping, the room was silent again, but her mirror, set across from the bed, was fogged over as though someone had leaned close and breathed upon it. The journalist who captured the mysterious recording of humming later admitted she left out certain details from her published piece. She told a friend privately that at around 3 in the morning, she heard music. Not just humming, but faint, melodic chords like a full arrangement carried from another room. When she walked toward the sound, following it down the hallway, the music seemed to shift, always just a step ahead, never in the room she entered. She felt as though it were leading her somewhere, drawing her deeper into the house. Only when she reached the sealed den did the sound stop completely, leaving her in thick silence, her hand trembling on the brass doorknob. She never turned it. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. As the years went by, the house developed a reputation not in the flashy way of Hollywood ghost tales, but in quiet, reluctant whispers. Realtors would show the property, walking briskly through the rooms with polite smiles, avoiding eye contact when potential buyers asked about the stories. Security guards hired for short-term contracts rarely lasted more than a week. Even the gardeners who worked during the day spoke of a strange sensation whenever they trimmed near the rear patio. The sudden drop in temperature, the faint vibration under their boots, as though bass notes were traveling up through the ground itself. Those who spent any real time inside noticed how the environment shifted with the setting sun. By late afternoon, the house seemed to grow heavier, the air thick and expectant, like a theater moments before a performance begins. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the tiled floors, clinging to corners, refusing to dissolve even when the lamps were turned on. And always, somewhere within that tension, came the first signs, the soft hum, that breath of resonance, like someone warming up their voice in the distance. The recording room, however, was different. Entering it felt like stepping across a boundary, as though the rest of the house belonged to the living but this one room did not. Even in daylight, the space carried a gloom, the curtains drawing in the walls, the stale perfume of incense and smoke lingering without source. People described feeling watched the moment the door closed behind them, a sensation of being inspected by something both familiar and unyielding. One researcher and audio technician who had worked in the music industry requested permission to spend a single evening inside, bringing with him sensitive recording equipment. He believed that the stories were simply vibrations trapped in the house's unique design, acoustic artifacts that echoed from traffic or nearby structures. For hours he recorded silence, the faint creak of wood, the steady hum of Los Angeles power lines in the background. But near midnight, his microphones began to pick up something else. A series of low, rhythmic pulses that grew stronger with each passing minute. They were not random. They carried timing, cadence, even phrasing, as if someone were layering the first bars of a song. The technician described what followed as the most chilling, yet beautiful sound I've ever heard. His headphones filled with the unmistakable hum of a man's voice, rich and resonant, stretching vowels into long, deliberate tones. He claimed it wasn't just sound, it carried warmth like standing too close to a subwoofer. The vibration moved through his chest, syncing with his heartbeat until he could hardly tell the difference between his pulse and the rhythm of the voice. And then came the words, not full sentences but fragments. A name he didn't recognize. A phrase repeated twice like a chorus half remembered. When he played the recordings back the next morning, the sounds were faint, muffled, but still they're impossible to dismiss. Yet what unnerved him most was that during the live experience, when he sat in that darkened room surrounded by his wires and monitors, the sound had not come through the headphones alone. It had filled the room. He could hear it with his bare ears. He left before dawn, shaking, and refused to release the full tapes. Outside of those brave enough to linger in the den, visitors to the house often reported another phenomenon mirrors. The estate was decorated with them. Long, gilded frames in the hallways, beveled glass in the bathrooms, a huge oval mirror in the main bedroom. More than one guest swore they caught reflections that did not belong to them. The movement of a figure in the corner, the tilt of a head behind their shoulder, the dark outline of a man seated in a chair that wasn't there when they turned around. Always tall, always broad, always still. One evening, a housekeeper tidying the master suite claimed she heard a faint melody drifting in the background, not a hum this time, but a whisper of strings, violins rising in slow harmony. She froze in the doorway, staring into the oval mirror across from the bed. She swore she saw a man's hands, resting heavy on the arms of a chair, fingers tapping to the rhythm of the invisible music. When she spun around, the room was empty, yet the glass still carried the faintest shadow of movement, dissolving like smoke in water. By then, few doubted that something remained. But whether it was memory, energy, or Barry White himself, no one could say. What unsettled everyone most was the nature of it. This wasn't a violent haunting. It wasn't screams, slamming doors, or objects hurled in rage. It was gentler, deeper, more intimate. A presence that wrapped around you like velvet, leaving you unsure if you were safe or if you were being lured into something you couldn't escape. The house became a kind of unspoken landmark among those who lived nearby. Neighbors didn't cross the gates without reason, and children who grew up on the street treated it like a dare, sprinting up to the iron fence at dusk, touching it, then racing back down the sidewalk with nervous laughter. They called it the singing house, though none of them ever lingered long enough to hear more than a faint hum. It was the adults who knew the fuller story, but they rarely spoke of it aloud. On evenings when the wind was still, you could sometimes catch the faintest rhythm in the air, the kind that made you think a stereo was playing 2 houses away, the bass line so subtle it traveled beneath the usual noise of traffic. People often looked for the source, checking cars, windows, radios, but the strange thing was, the sound always seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. A vibration that hung just at the edge of hearing, until you stepped closer to the white estate, where it grew distinct enough to feel. The driveway itself was unnerving at night. Long, lined with palms whose shadows cut across the pavement, it seemed to funnel you toward the front door whether you wanted to approach or not. Visitors described a curious pull as they walked up, not just the slope of the drive, but something heavier, as though the air thickened and nudged them forward. By the time they reached the massive wooden door, most people were already sweating, heartbeats oddly in sync with that low rhythm that seemed to pulse from within the house. Inside, the walls carried a strange acoustics. Sounds lingered, stretched. A whisper spoken in the kitchen could be heard faintly in the hallway. A footstep upstairs might echo longer than it should. Some believed the design amplified these effects, while others thought it was the house itself, as though the structure had soaked up years of music and refused to let it go. Walking through at night was unnerving because you were never sure what was real sound and what was memory bleeding through. The living room was the grandest space. High ceiling, thick wooden beams, heavy velvet drapes that once shut out the sunlight for recording sessions. By day, it looked like any aging but elegant room. But at night, with the curtains drawn, it became a chamber of shadows. Many swore that sitting quietly in the room long enough brought about a sensation like being in an audience. The weight of unseen eyes pressing in from all sides, as though rows of invisible figures filled the darkened corners, waiting for a performance to begin. The stories that circulated most, however, always led back to the den, the recording room. Some refused to enter at all. The few who did often emerged pale and shaken, unwilling to describe what they had felt inside. But every now and then someone spoke. A man hired to repaint the room in the late 2000s said the air was unbearable. Not hot, he explained, but thick, like the whole room was filled with breath. He claimed his ladder shifted as he worked, though no one was near, and when he steadied himself, he realized he could hear music faintly through the walls. Not just humming, but a slow, deliberate melody, layered with harmony, like the opening swell of a song. He left the ladder standing and walked out, never finishing the job. Another account came from a woman who stayed overnight while house-sitting. She admitted she was curious about the rumors, and at 2 a.m. she went into the recording room with only a flashlight. She sat in the center of the carpet and waited, forcing herself to remain still despite the pressure in her chest. She said it started as a vibration under the floor, traveling upward until her whole body buzzed with it. Then came the sound of voice, low and smooth, humming as though just behind her shoulder. She felt the air shift, as if someone leaned close, their presence warm and undeniable. When she turned, of course, no one was there, but her flashlight flickered against the walls, and in that moment, she saw the curtains move a slow, heavy sway, though the windows were sealed tight. And then came the mirror. The housekeeper's story about reflections wasn't the only one. Mirrors in the house had long been sources of unease. Guests complained of feeling stared at in their reflection, even when they were alone. One claimed the glass seemed delayed, showing her movements a fraction slower than real time. Another swore she saw the faint outline of a figure seated behind her, only for it to vanish when she spun around. The most chilling report described a reflection that didn't vanish at all. A tall silhouette standing in the mirror's edge, swaying gently to the rhythm of unheard music. Even skeptics found themselves rattled. A local skeptic society, curious after hearing so many second-hand tales, arranged for 2 volunteers to spend the night with cameras and audio devices. They came prepared, mocking the rumors, assuring neighbors they would debunk the myths once and for all. But by morning, both refused to speak publicly about their experience. Privately, one admitted to a friend that he had heard the humming, not through equipment, but in his own chest. He described it as like being sung to from the inside, his heartbeat swallowed by a deeper resonance that refused to let go. From that night forward, he never returned. In time, the house's reputation became impossible to shake. Realtors quietly stopped showing it after dark, and even in the daylight, potential buyers would sense something different in the air. No one stayed for long. The estate passed hands briefly, investors, corporations, trust accounts, but no individual ever called it home. It was as if the house itself rejected the idea of being claimed by anyone else. The last serious attempt came from a film crew hoping to document the haunting. They brought in cameras, microphones, and motion sensors, convinced they could capture something definitive. For 3 nights, they filled the house with equipment, monitoring every corner, every hallway. The first 2 nights passed with little more than unexplained hums, a flickering light here and there. But on the 3rd night, everything changed. At exactly 2:11 a.m., all the audio channels lit up at once. Not static, not interference, but music. A slow, rising melody filled every recorder simultaneously, so clear it sounded like it had been performed live in the room. Strings swelled, bass rumbled, and through it all, a voice began to hum. It wasn't words, just tones, drawn out, deliberate, carrying a warmth that made the hair on their arms stand up. The crew, stunned, stood in the living room, looking at each other as the sound grew louder. One cameraman swore he saw the velvet curtains ripple, though no air moved. Another insisted a shadow crossed the far end of the room, tall, broad, moving with the rhythm of the invisible music. And then came the moment that none of them forgot. The chandelier above, unlit all evening, flickered to life with a soft golden glow. The light bathed the room in warmth, not harsh, not electric, but gentle like candlelight spreading across a stage. It lasted less than a minute. When the sound faded, the lights went out, and silence fell like a curtain drop. The crew packed up before dawn, shaken. Though they had hours of recordings, they never released them in full. One producer admitted privately that the files, when played back later, carried more than just sound. They carried vibration. The speakers would tremble, and if you stood too close, you could feel the hum moving through your chest, syncing with your heartbeat until you stepped away. After that, no one tried again. Today, the house still stands, quiet behind its iron gates. By daylight, it looks like any other aging Los Angeles estate, its gardens overgrown, its windows reflecting the sun. But at night, neighbors still pause when they pass by. Some cross the street rather than walk the sidewalk in front. And every so often, in the silence of the valley, they hear it again, that unmistakable baritone hum, rich and smooth, floating on the still air. Some say it's only the wind, a trick of the imagination. Others believe it's memory itself, pressed into the walls like grooves on a vinyl record, replaying over and over. But there are those who swear it's something more. That Barry White, whose voice was too powerful, too soulful to ever fade, never really left his home. And maybe, if you stand close enough on the right night, you'll hear it too, the house itself singing back to you, deep, slow, and unforgettable. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.